Welcome, compañeros, to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. I am Carlos El Chacon, your host, and I am joined today by Kevin Fiesel.
Hello.
We're going to excuse Eugene Meininger. He is down in sunny Florida, soaking up a little sun and recharging the batteries, I think. So that's what he's doing. So our topic today is going to be replicating data with Azure Data Sync, Azure SQL Data Sync. Right, I have to make sure we get all these service names correct.
Must be buzzword compliant.
That's right. And so as we get into that, let's see, our show notes for today's episode are going to be at sqldatapartners.com/replicate data or at sqldatapartners.com/241. And we have quite the list of folks that we need to give shout outs to. Oh my goodness. So here we go. We've got Alicia Stringer, Diego Perez Reggie, Swatina Sakya, Arawind Kotharand, Lucivanda Quiroz, Madi Chen, Mark B, who I guess is down now your way in Durham.
Yep.
James Conley.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah, David Shower. Jason Horner, who's probably skiing somewhere. Peter Larson, John F. Cates. We've got Doug Kemp. Hey, Doug, longtime listener. Ian Groves, Tony Hokenbauer. I want to say Hokenbauer, but that's not. Anyway.
There's no EN.
Yeah, that's right.
Hochbauer.
There we go. Jeremy Fry, Jim Staley, Joe Sheffield, Seth Hills, Paul Ward, Michael Wharton, and Patrick Stevens. So thanks, compañeros. We do appreciate you engaging with us in some way, giving a little love to the podcast, and however way you're doing that. So as we're getting into the new year, let's see, have we done an episode this year? All of a sudden, my mind is escaping me. My old man disease. Onset dementia. So I guess
2 weeks ago.
If you have already listened to that, I'll say Happy New Year again. It's still January, right? I feel like I can say Happy New Year, for the whole month.
In fairness, I think you can say Happy New Year as long as you accidentally write 2021 when you're writing down dates. So once that goes to 2022, you can no longer say Happy New Year.
There we go. Official rules from Kevin Fiesel, right? So there you go. So I guess I need to write down the date. What date am I going to write down? So I guess I'm still writing 2021 to be compliant with your rule there. Okay, so as we started the new year, right, and you're thinking about monitoring your database and you have a SolarWinds license, SolarWinds SQL Sentry license, or you want a SolarWinds SQL Sentry license, we'd love to be able to help you with that. So here at SQL Data Partners, we've teamed up with SolarWinds to be able to provide those to you, can help you with the setup, get some best practices, etc. So let us know, reach out to us. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or hit us up on our website at sqldatapartners.com for more information about how to obtain SQL Sentry licenses from SolarWinds. And so with that, right, wanted to jump into our episode today. So replicating data, Azure SQL Data Sync. And we actually did talk about this before. So let's see, Amanda reminded me. And I do need to give a shout out to Amanda, right? Helping me out with all the shout outs and putting together the pieces here. So we had one of the Azure data, the Azure PMs, the Microsoft PMs for Azure Data Sync. And her name was, it was Wei Chen Wu. I think I'm probably not saying that right. But back in April, so 2 years ago, just about, we talked a little bit about that. And so one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up again, and Kevin may have his own reasons, was that we've had a couple of instances of customers wanting to implement this. And I thought it might be interesting to just walk through the why, their experiences. And, again, we can give an overview of how it's changed a bit, or at least how it's working now, right? I won't know that I can detail all of the advancements that have happened in the last 2 years.
So wait, does this mean I get to interview you on how customers have done? The tables have turned?
The tables have turned. We're going to do the tables have turned episode. There you go.
But they're only turning a little bit because Carlos is still going to be Carlos for most of this.
It's hard to break, tradition, habit, you get into that, to that mode. And so, one of the first, so we actually, ironically enough, right, did two of these projects right around the same time. And they were for two unique needs. But let me go ahead and set up Azure Data Sync and perhaps why you would want it. So as the name implies, you're going to need an Azure SQL database to use the Azure SQL Data Sync service. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to, let's see, I guess as I say that out loud, no. Yeah, and it has to act as the hub, right?
Yep. That central server has to be Azure SQL Database, not managed instances,
right.
Actual Azure SQL DB.
That's right. So in the first case, we had a customer that had an on-premise database that they wanted to push data into an Azure SQL database, right? And in the second instance, we had an Azure SQL database based in US East, but they had customers in Europe. And they were actually using Access as the front end. And the Access connecting to US East from Europe was, they were lacking in their experience, right? Just a little, that pipe across the Atlantic Ocean was just a little too much for them, a little too slow. So what they wanted to do was to create a second Azure SQL database in the Europe data center, and then sync those two back, mostly for reporting purposes. And so one of the things, and so with both of those, I think it's worth noting that I won't say these are production environments, right? Don't get me wrong, but latency was not a critical factor here, right? They weren't looking for, hey, my data has to be real time sync. Now, to be fair, I think it's pretty good, right? You put on the sync process, and it's very similar to like a log shipping. If you're familiar with log shipping, right, you can kind of appreciate that. But that is one of the unique characteristics I thought about each of these instances, is that they didn't necessarily, they were flexible, right? I guess with the sync process, right? And so that was, at least in this case, the why. Why would you want to use this? Is you've got data that you want to move around. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be the database. You can select certain tables, a la replication, right, and say, hey, this is what I want to move around. So now, Kevin, you can hop in here, right? Because when we think about the way that it gets set up, we've already mentioned that there's a hub piece, right? And maybe I should have asked you earlier, right? But you want to take us through some of the architecture pieces, or do you want me to do that?
Sure. Let's talk about it. You have hubs, which implies that there probably are also spokes, seeing as how that kind of goes together topology wise.
Yep.
And that hub must be Azure SQL Database. The spokes, or
what you're connected to.
Yeah, technically they're called member databases, but
right.
I like calling them spokes. Those can be in Azure SQL Database as well. They could be on-premises SQL Server. They could be virtual machines in Azure, in AWS, whatever. Mm-hmm. But they're running SQL Server or Azure SQL Database.
Right.
And you've got to have also in your Azure region a sync metadata database. That's going to have metadata and logs for Azure Data Sync, Azure SQL Data Sync. That has to be an Azure SQL database in the same region as your hub database.
Right.
You'll create that yourself. You'll own it yourself. And as a note, you can only have one sync metadata database per region and subscription. Also, while you've got a sync group active, so while you have this connection set up, you cannot delete or rename your sync metadata database.
Right. And
you have, go ahead.
So it's just from a cost perspective. So obviously you have your Azure SQL database, depending on normally the size is going to depend on your tier. Again, for something like this, the hub database is generally not in the transactional processing, right? It just kind of serves as the master or where everything's going to be hooked up to. So you don't necessarily, although you don't necessarily have to have an application hitting that database, right? So you can potentially get away with with a smaller DTU. And the metadata one that we've seen is generally pretty small, right? It's you can get away with some small tiers.
Yeah, and when you get to the point of requiring this maybe for applications, especially if you're talking about a scenario of global distribution, like for what you were talking about, Carlos, with the customer who has data in the US, has services in Europe. And in that case, Azure SQL Data Sync, you want that hub database not to be your primary accessed database. You can think of it as a fairly complex replication style of topology. As a quick note, it's not replication. It doesn't use replication.
Correct.
It's a totally different technology.
Word, right? Don't be confused.
Yep. But if you're familiar with replication, there are scenarios where you have your publisher that just exists. You don't directly connect to the publisher. Instead, you connect to all of the subscribers, or whichever subscriber is most relevant to you. This is especially the case if you were talking about merge replication. Right. But even if you do bidirectional transactional replication, you have this idea that I don't need to connect to the central server. I connect to one of the connected servers and do all of my work there and let the central server receive the transmissions from everybody else and distribute out those messages to the other machines. And looks like Eugene has soaked up all of the rays from Florida and has brought them back.
No, I wish. I got COVID, so I'm stuck in Pennsylvania, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. I wish
you had made the trip or not, right? So
no. Literally the day. Yeah, no. The day before we went, Miles started to get sick. I was like, let's get tested just to be sure. And then
no, just go and then get
right
down there. You can quarantine in the Kissimmee, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I decided to be responsible.
So that's why Eugene was a little late, because the solar charger is a little slower in winter in Pennsylvania.
Especially right now, we got a lot of snow.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another scenario. So we're working with I guess we're looking at it. We're investigating with another customer in terms of the update piece. To jump back to the Azure SQL database, as interesting as Eugene's travels are. So one of the things they wanted to do was they have several plants that they would like to keep. So these are manufacturing, right? So they have equipment, each of the plants that creates a job, right? Manufacturers, widgets. And so these instructions need to come from a central place. But as you can imagine, sometimes these manufacturing plants are not in the most, they have internet issues. And so they're not able to, it goes down and they still want to do business even though the internet's down, right? And so we looked at ways that they could use the Azure Data Sync as a way to keep a master repository, be able to push that out locally to on-premise SQL servers, So that way the machines on those sites could continue to use the local SQL server, but the updates could still happen. And even if they missed an update and they used the old instruction, right, if that wasn't a catastrophic event, it would be better for them to continue to move forward, even if the instruction was, not up to date or not the very most recent one. And so I think that so as we've started to peek at this, we have seen more and more instances where particularly partial sets of data do need to get moved around. And I've actually been impressed with Azure SQL Data Sync, right? Knock on wood. It's, so it has its own set of, I guess, requirements, right? Kevin's talked to us through some of those. But once it gets set up and functional, I've actually been really impressed. We compared to some of the other technologies that have been used in the past to try to keep data in sync, I feel like I've had way less issues with this one, right? Again, knock on wood, to this point.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to call out is something to set some expectations if you do go down the route of Azure SQL Data Sync, and that is, like Carlos said, you may have data that is not completely up to date. There is no transactional consistency. You're not going to update your data on your member database in Spokane, Washington, and have it show up in Nepal instantly. It's not going to happen on commit.
Right.
There is a process for that data update, and it will eventually make it there. But if you're querying that same data at the same time and sync hasn't completed yet, especially if you have a very busy system, you will have some latency.
Right.
So I guess a question that I have is how do people deal with like auto increment keys or that sort of thing? Do you have to, like, instead of the beautiful integer numbers we're used to, have to basically add like a region, like composite key or something at the beginning, you know what I mean, or something like that? Because that's the biggest thing that comes to my mind is there's certain situations where it's almost like a multi-tenant environment, so to speak, and so no transactional consistency is fine because you're just kind of writing your own stuff. You're just dealing with your own turf, yep. Right? But I mean, what do you do for situations where normally you have like an auto increment or something like that, where like, how do they get the keys?
Yeah.
So, well, it does support identity columns, so it does support that auto incrementer as long as it is the primary key constraint.
Right. Okay.
Right. Now, what we did because of the relay and so this is an ordering system. I've got orders in the US, I've got orders in Europe. Now, sure. I need the orders to combine ultimately for reporting purposes. So as a reporting, I want to see all that information in one system. But the orders are going to come in at different times. And we've already talked about them. Like, I need both orders. So we couldn't have them overlap. So what we did is we actually made all the US orders even and all the European orders odd.
Oh, yeah.
And so we just did the syncs there, right? So then they're adding, and then they combined, and there's no contention there. So yeah, I would generally tend to think that if you need data to converge like that, then you're going to want to think through those keys, right? So plant number one is 1 million, right? Plant number 2 is 2 million, whatever it is, whatever your sequencing is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're familiar with merge replication, first, I'm sorry. Second, there is that capability for having the merge clients have identity ranges. I would probably just go a different route and say, like Eugene said, have a specific plant ID or situation, location ID, or whatever to guarantee that a thing being written to a particular database will be unique, even if there is overlap in that identity integer.
That makes sense. Yeah. Because I think in a lot of cases, once you've got the the keys down, once you've got referential integrity handled, then transactional consistency just becomes a lot less important, right? And so I can see it. I can see, like, as long as you have that figured out, I can see this tool supporting a lot of scenarios.
Because the sync, I mean, we talked about being trigger based, which, let me go down that rabbit hole just for a minute. One of the things that then does is it's going to put extra tables in your database. And so if you're used to using things like the Redgate, compare tools or whatnot, right now, all of a sudden you've got extra stuff you've got to deal with, which again, the Azure Data Sync process is going to handle and will sometimes change, which is going to throw your sync tools off. So that's a little bit cumbersome. However, but because the requirement is the tables have primary keys, you can always resync them, right? I've never felt uncomfortable about, again, losing that data, because the transactional consistency is to my local table, right? And then I get to decide in terms of I guess the next piece that perhaps we talk about is when there is a collision, who wins? And you get to decide that. Does the spoke win, right? Or the member, or does the hub win?
Similar to merge replication.
That's right.
Which, again, that's a real pain point dealing with conflict in merge replication. It's something you certainly want to avoid. If you're in a situation where you're potentially in conflict, it's better to do whatever you can to avoid even getting in that situation.
No, agreed.
So since you mentioned one limitation, might be worth talking about a couple of other limits on what the product offers, how your data has to be, or how your tables need to be set up.
Yep.
And most of the limitations are pretty reasonable. Some of them are less reasonable than others, but most of them are okay. And for example, if your primary key is a date time column, whether that be date time 2, date time offset, or time, this only is accurate to the second for a primary. So supported precision is down to the second.
Yeah.
And I find that kind of interesting. It seems like it's probably writing out as text or something. That's a guess. That I have no answer for that, but that is a general limitation. Basically, if you're building a bunch of date time 2 with 7 precision because you need to get down to that nanosecond level, it sounds like SQL Data Sync may not actually push at that level.
Right. Yeah, so that's fair, right? So another consideration, right, is granularity, right? How specific do you need it?
Yep. One of the limitations that I find a little bit constraining is if you have 2 tables, different schemas, same name, only one of them can be in a sync group. So if you have dbo.users and archived.users, only one of those 2 tables is allowed.
That's weird.
Right.
It is a little weird.
I'm not sure why that constraint would be there.
My guess is all the names are based off of the table name and not the schema and table name.
Yeah, which could be annoying if you're using schemas for like testing and development and that sort of thing. Of course, I don't know how common that is.
Yeah, good question.
You also can't use Azure Active Directory. So the connections between the databases have to use SQL authentication, at least currently, right? I can't speak to when and if that's going to be on the roadmap, but that's a current limitation.
True. That's a bit of a limitation. It's one of those things where I say, I guess if you're going to support both on-premises SQL Server and Azure SQL Database, you were probably using SQL authentication to begin with.
Sure.
But not ideal.
It just removes you for having to sync all that stuff, right? Like, hey, I need, the users that you're going to connect with, and you kind of get to, yeah. free yourself up from having to require another feature in order to use this feature, right?
Yeah, though it is a downside compared to a replication-based solution where you're able to use Windows authentication and use different Windows Active Directory accounts for the different machines in your replication topology. One interesting thing is table truncation is not actually tracked by data sync. Deletion, yes. Truncation, no. So if you have a large table, like a staging table that you regularly truncate, basically those changes won't be moved over.
Right, because they won't get picked up by the trigger.
Right.
Yeah.
So the trigger is on delete, but similarly, if you use a lot of bulk insert, by default, triggers don't fire on bulk insert operations. That's one of the ways that bulk inserts are faster, which means you might have to modify your bulk insert or basically insert into whatever tables, whatever data that you have actually insert as part of the bulk process.
Right. Now you can use the fire triggers option on the bulk insert, and that will get you. That's kind of the workaround. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll slow down your bulk insert considerably, but if you're using Azure SQL Data Sync and you need bulk insert, you'll get that capability.
Right.
Just remember, if you're using, for example, integration services to load a table, bulk load is the default, and typically fire triggers is not activated. You'll have to manually check your packages and ensure that that is active.
Right.
So another interesting thing is that all of your names, so sysname in SQL Server is in varchar 128. Database, table, schema, column names are limited to 50 characters. Which means somebody didn't use sysname, they used in varchar 50.
There you go. A little behind the scenes. We're making some inferences there.
We are making inferences. Information could be wrong, but when they pick 50 as the limit, that's right. A sign that the developer who did this didn't use sysname somewhere. Like 50 characters is long enough. No Oracle. It is not long enough. It's 128 for a reason, because I need 128.
Yeah.
So something I'm curious about with all this is how much do you think, specifically, the hub database has to be an Azure SQL database?
Yep.
And so my question is, how much do you think is, okay, there's some capability infrastructure-wise that Azure SQL Database just made super, super easy, and how much was they want kind of this center of gravity to be in Azure, and they're trying to find more and more ways to kind of make people fall into the pit of success, we'll say, and make their way towards Azure.
Cynically, I'd probably say the latter.
Yeah.
That look, it supports SQL Server. It probably could work just as well on SQL Server, but the hub database must be an Azure SQL database.
Yeah, because they've got bidirectional working, so it's not a directionality issue per se. So, yeah, I don't know. Because I could see this kind of functionality being useful for certain like entirely on-premises situations too.
Yeah, and that's where I'm sure the answer would be, well, that's what merge replication and peer-to-peer replication, depending on your scenario, maybe even bidirectional transactional replication.
Right.
But it's all replication all the time at that point.
Everybody's idea of a good time, right?
Now, one thing that is a little weird, and again, is if you, depending on the number of changes you think you're going to be making to that system, is that technically schema changes aren't supported, right? So if you want to change the schema, you actually have to stop replication, update both nodes, update your hub, and your member, and then re-enable.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, man.
So if you think you're going to be doing a lot of development there, that is another, potential downside. If you're like, hey, right, this is what it is, and if I'm going to make a change, I'm going to put it in another table, right, or I'm going to, address this in a different way. And it's not to say that it's impossible, but just from a scale or a rollout perspective, right, you now have multiple nodes that you're dealing with, right, when you want to say add a column, and you want that column updated, right? Which I can only imagine you would, right? Why add a column? You're like, yeah, I don't care if that data is in the other database, right? Now that's.
So I guess a question about that: Does Microsoft just trust you to make sure that when you have to pause it and redo it, that the databases are in sync, or how does that work? Because from what I remember with like mirroring, I think you had to redo the whole thing. And it could be a real pain, although it's been a number of years since I've had to set up database mirroring.
Right. Well, and let's see
mirroring wouldn't really be a factor here because you have to keep them in sync. Yeah, so you're right. You basically break mirroring and then essentially restore a database and start over.
Right.
Replication is again probably the closer scenario here, where technically, if you make schema changes in replication, you're supposed to reinitialize the subscription, reinitialize the publication, and rebuild the subscriptions and deploy that new data out. But in practice, once you have a real replication set up, you pause replication, you alter the tables, and you say, don't worry, I totally reinitialized. Everything is fine.
Right.
Right. So, yeah.
That makes sense.
But again, you can't, so it's not you can't make changes. It's just that it's not going to do it for you. You can't deploy to the hub and then be like, hey, hub, right, go push out this change for me. I am only doing data. That's it.
Right.
So
yeah, and it's probably for the best because thinking about the way that different tools have process database schema changes. Oh, I see you added a new column. Here, allow me to helpfully create a temp table, load all of the data into the temp table, drop the old table, rename the new table. This will take me 5 hours, but don't worry, it'll be done.
I got it under control. Yeah.
Yeah, unless I error out, in which case I leave you in a inconsistent state.
Sure. So yeah, mate. So more and more. So you can put additional filters on there as well. You don't necessarily have to do all the tables in the database, right? You get to pick which tables you're gonna sync. And so I found this to be more compelling, right? Working with organizations that want to move some data around or copy it and make it available for two distinct groups that have different needs, right? A la, right, I don't have internet, or I need it in Azure, right, where my customer can go use it and they're not mucking with our stuff, right?
Yep. Another thing to keep in mind is if you ever update your primary keys, not even the column that is used, but let's say ID number 123. If that updates, you actually will not necessarily get the data in your other member databases. So by design, changes in a primary key column will result in inconsistent data in the rows where the primary key was changed. So if you're going to fix that, instead of updating ID 123 to 456, you delete 123. That way it triggers a delete operation, and then you insert 456. And then you'll get your updated data. Now, if you're updating some column that is not part of the primary key constraint, then it's just an update. So if I update person's name, and that name is not part of the primary key, then it's okay. But if I update the primary key value, then I've got a problem. Now, one thing that saddens me here is it looks like Azure SQL Data Sync does not support filtered indexes. No indexes with where clauses. So
there you go.
That's a little bit of a downer.
Yeah,
gonna need a moment to
hopefully get some ongoing development and love.
Right.
Yeah.
So, compañeros, if you are using Azure SQL Data Sync, we'd love to hear your story. Right? Why'd you choose it, and how's it going for you? We've had some compelling cases, and we'd be very interested in hearing yours as well. So last words about Azure Data Sync.
I'm going to make a comparison to replication like I've done 15 times already. Those are my last words.
There we go.
Since I thankfully do not have a lot of experience with replication, I'll say it definitely seems like a promising technology. And honestly, I'm hoping that a lot of the maturity in services from Microsoft is what this kind of thing looks like, where it's like, okay, this is a known problem. We've been dealing with it for 20 or 30 years. And we're getting closer and closer to a solution where you don't have to think about it so much. Like, obviously, we talked about all the edge cases and everything. But I'd really love to see just more of that maturity in software. And I think there's plenty of room for that from Microsoft.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, I've been happy with it. To this point, it's worked well, and has done what we needed to do. Right.
Right.
That's good. So. Okay, well, I think that's going to do it for today's episode then. Let's see. As always, compañeros, you can reach out to us. Mr. Eugene, how can folks connect with you?
Yeah, well, you can trudge through a foot of snow in PA, or you can find me on Twitter at SQLgene.
Mr. Kevin?
So my information was in a row, but the key got updated, and now it's all gone.
Yeah,
you're going to have to delete and reinsert it.
Azure SQL Data Sync.
Kevin is transactionally inconsistent.
Just like in real life.
Yeah.
Okay, compañeros, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am at Carlos El Chacon. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. And we'll see you on the SQL Trail. Bye, y'all.
Data Partners.